Good evening, good people, and welcome to the Neil Oliver Show on GBNews TV, on radio and online. On tonight's show, I'll be chatting about a project called the Hope Accord, which, amongst other things, is calling for all mRNA products to be suspended, plus a campaigner who says she lost her parents to dementia because of the Scottish Government's strict lockdown rules. However, I'll also be joined by GP Malcolm Kendrick, who has a very different view on how the COVID pandemic was managed. And I'll be reflecting on the news that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is a free man after a plea deal allowed him to walk free from a London prison. All of that and more in the company of journalist and financial expert Jasmine Birtles. But first, an update on the latest news headlines. The worldwide threat to freedom comes not just from the globalists of the World Economic Forum and their ilk and their puppets squatting on top of the pyramid. Those determined to rule, to take and keep control of what everyone is doing to run the world, inevitably apply the tactics and make the moves we see around us. Bad faith individuals, bad actors, do bad things. We know this, or we should by now. More insidious than the agendas being pushed down onto our heads from above are the many and varied divisions that have been sowed at the same time, divisions between we the people. We've been set at each other's throats deliberately, even more so over the last 4 years, until we are blaming each other for all the trouble. I understand why it's happening because I feel the same urge, which is to build walls against those whose opinions differ from mine. I also feel the urge to find someone to blame for all that's happening. And it's easier to blame people I can see than people I can't. But when we give in to those urges, if we all behave this way, blaming each other, excluding others when we should be welcoming them, we do the baddies' work for them. They must be laughing at us now, laughing all the way to the bank. This atomising of people, the cutting of ties that should bind, making enemies of anyone and everyone, ends in a place where no one believes a word anyone else says, where no one trusts that anyone else is acting in good faith. As Martin says in the 1931 Dracula movie, they're all crazy except me and you. Sometimes I have my doubts about you. It's a zero-sum game. I watched the coverage of the release of journalist Julian Assange. It's been reported that he and his team reached a deal with his persecutors, one that rings alarm bells for human rights organisations. He and WikiLeaks had published hundreds of thousands of classified documents that laid bare the murky goings-on of the US government. And in response, they went after him with everything they had, aided and abetted by the government of the United Kingdom. After nearly 15 years of incarceration of one sort or another, incarceration without trial, Assange is a free man. And already he is being torn down in all manner of ways, not least on account of whatever was in the fine print of the plea deal. Human rights organisations fear the consequences of any pledge not to publish classified information. They fear the consequences for the First Amendment to the US Constitution, the consequences for freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I'm no closer to the truth of it all than any other member of the public, but there's no missing the determination out there, even now, by all manner of commentators, great and small, to seek to portray Assange as a sinner, someone not to be trusted. Assange is just one man, but what has happened to him, what is still happening to him, serves as a warning of what can happen to anyone in a world where freedom is regarded not as an inalienable right of all, but as conditional, grace and favour, a temporary pass handed down by the powerful and that might be snatched away at any time, for any reason or for no reason. When governments snatched away our freedom on the pretext of what they insisted was a pandemic, a small and fragile coalition formed in opposition, questioning lockdowns, questioning mandates for masks and jabs. By now, that early unity has fractured, as elements within found it easier to shout down and tear down those notionally on their own side than to keep directing their fire towards the truly guilty. Into those cracks flowed the meddling of those guilty, exploiting the divisions and creating as many new ones as possible. Now the factions, angry and frustrated by all that's truly wrong, are entrenched in their own small camps that are getting smaller by the day, lobbing grenades at one another. While it remains as true as on day one of all the malevolent nonsense of the COVID debacle, that none of the guilty are being held to account, one voice after another asking some good questions has been ripped to shreds, discredited and cast down, not by the enemy, but by their own side. There's a purity test out there that no one can pass. Any past failing, real or imagined, is deemed to be grounds for cancellation by our own side. The most unforgivable sin of all is not having been aware and vocal soon enough, of having taken too long to realise what was going on. And this accusation is used to silence and censor almost at will. Among the most effective slurs applied with equal vigour by both the bad actors and those supposed to be fighting for freedom is that of controlled opposition. I looked up the term and found controlled opposition is the use of black propaganda and saboteurs who claim to oppose a particular faction but are in fact working for the faction. I've lost count of how many times I've been labelled controlled opposition. It's pretty much a daily occurrence, but it's thrown around like confetti. As a general rule, here's what happens. Someone finds an outlet for challenging some or all that's going on in this grievously and tragically altered world of ours, a world I struggle to recognise. And for some time, usually brief, they get a hearing. But as sure as eggs is eggs, someone, somewhere, eventually cries controlled opposition, and that mud sometimes sticks. For controlled opposition, you can also read shill and grifter. Always the intention is the same, which is to sow in as many minds as possible the idea that whomever is speaking, regardless of what they're actually saying, that they are either knowingly and deceitfully in the pay of big government or big pharma or the intelligence military-industrial complex, or perhaps worse, unknowingly and haplessly doing the bidding of any or all of the above bad actors without even knowing it. Either way, it's a crime that ensures a conviction every time. There is no way of successfully disproving the allegation of being controlled opposition. The only option is either to sit down and shut up or carry on under the weight of having been so attacked. As I say, this relentless attrition, the self-inflicted wounds, leads to one destination and one destination only, which is the bleeding to death of any hope of concerted opposition. As well as controlled opposition, shill and grifter, those speaking out are usefully labelled from a cornucopia of damning insults. Anti-Semite, racist, Putin apologist, anti-vaxxer, granny killer, far right, conspiracy theorist, take your pick and apply liberally. Julian Assange's character has been under attack by some for years. Whomever is stoking it, the intended end point is the same, to sow distrust, to have as many people as possible question motives and intent. These tactics make lonely outcasts of us all. Another consequence has been that anyone minded to raise their voice, to stand up, must face the withering fire, not just of the state and the puppets of the state, but of the very people they're seeking to stand alongside and help. It's in this way that the baddies always win. There are so many lines by which to be divided. Creed, colour, class, gender, politics, nationality. The list is endless. In order to turn the tables on the forces ranged against us, we have to set aside differences, real and imagined. Remember as well that my enemy's enemy is my friend. There will come a time when the war is finally won, when there might be a point in revisiting all those things that divide us as unique individuals. But for now, those differences must be set aside. The real threat to freedom is not posed by those alongside us, by those we can see. The real threat comes from above, from that thin veneer made of the parasite class that so successfully, over and over and over again, sets ordinary people against other ordinary people, drives us to hurt one another, so the parasites can, metaphorically at least, suck our blood. Within that fragile freedom coalition, where the only unifying factor and the only one we need is awareness that we are being played by those determined to control and exploit the mass of the population in every conceivable way. Within that coalition, we trip time and again over our own feet, and we do this by holding each other to an infinitely higher standard than those we should be concentrating on fighting and tearing down. A newly fledged voice, whenever it appears, is instantly scrutinised for every word and deed, present and past. That new voice might make good point after good point, ask pertinent question after pertinent question, but always the moment comes when the grievance archaeologists unearth some or other past remark or behaviour, or when the voice is heard to say just one thing out of line, and then the purity test is applied. The speaker is always judged to have failed, and the voice is silenced. And who wins? Who gains? The enemy every time. The simple fact of the matter is that it's unity we need, and a realisation that while we all have our imperfections and our past transgressions, we must allow for those, forgive those, at least until the war is won. Another simple fact is that the enemy is so much better at all of this than we are, not least because they've been at their corrupt and corrupting business for so long now. They say it takes 10,000 hours of practice and repetition to master a skill. Well, the enemy has been at it for a lot longer than that. Whatever their differences, however much they might dislike one another, along whatever lines they divide in terms of their objectives, they are utterly brilliant at sticking together to get what they want. They make mistake after mistake, get things wrong over and over, lie into our faces. But do you see them tear each other down? No. The past few years make it plain. They pushed a pandemic, they pushed products that may have been neither safe nor effective into billions of people. They provoke war and sacrifice the hundreds of thousands for the sole aim of making and laundering money. They get caught lying. They refuse, point blank refuse, to contemplate the dreadful consequences of what they did. They're exposed for all of these crimes and more besides, and are any of them ever held to account? On the contrary, the usual suspects, all the guilty parties, now have more prestigious jobs, more money, their reputations are untouched and unblemished. The politicians among them have the unmitigated gall to stand for re-election, and, which is the worst of all, they are collectively closer to their masters' objectives than ever before. While we are goaded into hating one another, distrusting one another, our enemy stands shoulder to shoulder. To get where we want to be, to achieve what we want to achieve, being the protection of our freedom, we have to stop demanding of each other the condition of having been right about everything every moment. If any mistake, any failing, is always grounds for exile to outer darkness, then we all lose in the end. Here's the thing. Back in the old world, the IRA used to torment the British Army by saying, you have to be lucky every day. We only have to be lucky once. We let the state away with one mistake after another, while at the same time demanding a flawless, perfect record from each other, forcing each other to have to be lucky every day, not just to never make a mistake in the present or future, but to have made no mistakes in the past either. That won't work, because that's not possible. The state is already hard at work presenting opponents to their will as one sort of terrorist or another, when by now we should be aware of who is actually aiming to terrify us, the ones in elected office. The baddies make their own luck, and they do it by setting aside their differences, tolerating the infinite failings of which every one of them is guilty individually and collectively, and instead simply sticking together and ruthlessly backing each other up until the job's done. To have any real hope of finally turning the tables on our adversary, we must learn to do likewise, and quickly. Joining me this week for the duration of the show, friend and journalist Jasmine Birtles. Jasmine, do you know what I mean when I say I thought at the beginning that we were getting somewhere and that we were all going to stick together, and then it just fell away like sand in the face of a tide.
It does feel like it, and everything that you've been saying is elements that I've been noticing. But what I was thinking is it's what you see in families, in churches, in charities, in political parties. The worst is from the inside. When you have attacks from the outside, you can get together and, as you say, attack that, and that can put you together. But when you start to have infighting, and you find it in companies as well. I remember working with one company, a big one, that took no notice at all of their competitors. All they want, each department was like those awful people upstairs. There was constantly competing, with that other department, whereas they should have been putting their firepower against their competitors. And so it's not just in the freedom movement, it's not just in the movement of people who are trying to push for a new and better world. It's across the board, I think.
Where do you think it comes from? I mean, I was suggesting that the forces, ranged against us have been at whatever they're at for a long time.
Oh, yes.
Is it just an experience? Or is it because so many of us have sort of blundered into the arena and we don't have the practice? It's
human nature, I think, honestly. And in a sense, the kind of people who are standing up and seeing what they're awake, they're seeing what's going wrong. Quite often we're more aware of wrong things, and when we'll point them out, we're quite sort of difficult people in many cases. That's why we're able to stand, But people who are compliant, who will go along with this, that and the other, they're the ones who don't understand why we're standing, why we're so annoyed, why we're so angry and upset.
And the controlled opposition thing.
Yes.
That's, I mean, and I've seen it, it's not just me, I've seen it applied to everybody else.
Yes.
Oh no, don't listen to them. That's
controlled opposition.
That's a Mossad asset.
Yes.
That's a CIA operative. Come on.
GBNews constantly described as that. Absolutely. Tucker Carlson, whoever you like. Certainly Russell Brand. All the time I'm hearing him, and as you say, it's strewn around like confetti. It's very difficult to speak against, but it's very difficult to prove as well. So it's one of those things that just sort of hangs in the air and does nobody any good, other than, as you say, the forces that we're trying to fight.
Indeed. First break of the evening, after which I will be chatting to, and Jasmine also, Dr. Claire Craig, who has set up the Hope Accord, which among other things is calling for all mRNA products to be suspended. Plus, we'll be talking to a campaigner who says she lost her parents to dementia because of the Scottish Government's strict lockdown rules. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show. My first guest this evening is Dr. Claire Craig, a consultant pathologist who has carried out a great deal of research into COVID-19. Thanks for being here again, Claire.
Thank you for having me.
Familiar face here now. You've brought us the Hope Accord, which I've looked at, and I think it's quite a remarkable document. It's signed by various clinicians calling for, amongst other things, the mRNA platform or product to be suspended. How has this come about?
Right, so it started off as a group of people who set up the People's Vaccine Inquiry in the UK. And that happened because 4 separate groups of professionals, the Heart Group, the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, the COVID Vaccines Children's Advisory Committee and the Perseus Group, had all submitted statements for the official UK inquiry, and that vaccine module of that inquiry had the can kicked down the road to 2025, and they've also got a situation now with sort of 12 days to hear 120 witnesses. So we thought, well, we've done all this work, it's not going to get heard, it needs to be heard, there's no point just waiting to be heard. So we'll get together and produce something that makes it accessible for the public, because it's important information. So we did that in collaboration with Patrick Fagan, who talked about the nudge aspects of what went on, and also with a group called Doctors for Patients UK, who are a large group of doctors with concerns who have been talking with each other and in contact with others as well around what they can do about the situation they find themselves in. So they've got, one employer in this country, they've got mortgages and families to think about, but they want to do something about their concerns. And several doctors within that group put a statement into the People's Vaccine Inquiry talking about what they've seen happen to their patients and how their patients have been affected by this. And that includes Dean Patterson, the cardiologist in Guernsey, who I think you've had on before, James Royal, who's a surgeon up in Newcastle, Aisha Malik, who's a GP in Birmingham. And when they started to write the conclusion to their statement, Tim Kelly, who's an A&E doc, saw this and thought, this has just got more value than just being the conclusion of this statement, because the point is it was something that all of these doctors could get behind. And we just need an ethical statement out there for doctors generally to be able to get behind and say we need to return to foundational medical ethical principles and to raise concerns about what's happened.
Absolutely, the ethical principles, yes, but the very idea that we've finally got to the point where someone or a group of people has come together to say these mRNA products, there's enough out there now to stop them, temporarily, if not permanently.
I mean, people have been saying that since 2021, but haven't been heard saying it. And the fact is, when you've got a medical product that is causing unacceptable harm, and there's absolutely no doubt that is what these products have done, you suspend them. That's what you have to do. And then you have to investigate what's happened and work out where the harm came from and make sure it never happens again. And the fact that hasn't happened actually anywhere is quite frightening. And
it's a good point, though, that what you've been saying and what has been found in the People's Vaccine Inquiry is earth-shattering. I mean, genuinely, it's earth-shattering. And yet, we haven't heard anything much about it at all. I mean, I'm a journalist, and I haven't seen very much at all about it in the press, in the media, maybe a little bit in the alternative media. I'm assuming it's being squashed, but there must be a way that we can get this information out there more.
I totally agree. And so one of the things that we've done with the People's Vaccine Inquiry is to give people calls to action what they can do to help get the word out there. So there's a letter there for people to print off and take to their GPs so that their GPs can come and see all the information on that website. And also maybe to your prospective MPs, why not? So, the public can absolutely help with this. We need them to help with this because you're right, that it's been ignored. And these are all serious, highly qualified people speaking rationally and carefully with evidence, and they're being ignored.
Absolutely. Now, there's always an alternative point of view in all of this, especially this. We have now GP, General Practitioner, Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, who's kind enough to join us as well. Hello, Dr. Kendrick.
Hello, thanks for inviting me on.
How do you react to this as a GP? You're in the front line of care, and this suggestion of a return to ethics, a pause at the very least, if not a removal of the mRNA products, and really a root and branch consideration of how the pandemic was handled and what that should tell us about the future.
Well, I think to sort of hold up my hand, I was sceptical about a great deal of the way that the pandemic was handled, especially some of the things that happened in nursing homes was outrageous in my opinion, definitely. And I think that part of the problem with the inquiry is, as I've tried to explain to everyone, the inquiry is not going to decide whether or not lockdowns or any action taken were or not appropriate. That really won't be what their remit is. It will be to look at whether or not the systems that exist could be improved in the future. So I don't think we're going to get any answers to anything from the COVID inquiry particularly. I think when it comes to vaccines, I mean, clearly these vaccines were introduced in a rush, in a hurry. That's true. I think anyone would support people looking into potential vaccine damage in more detail. The problem is that both sides seem to be making astonishing claims, and it's very difficult to believe either of them. I think, I read 46 million lives have been saved by vaccination? Maybe I'm making that up, but I'm sure somebody made a claim like that.
Is it not the case, though? Is it not the case that it's not questioned that people have died, and many more people than have died are facing long-term consequences as a result of the mRNA products? And at what point do we say, right, suspension at the very least, and these things don't come back onto the market and they don't go into even one more arm without some kind of review?
Well, I think that the problem issue here really is that, of course, In fact, I wrote a blog when COVID started saying that I suspected that after all the lockdowns and everything, the rate of cardiovascular disease would explode for sort of mainly for sociological, psychological reasons, and that's happened. Also, almost everyone has been exposed to and has been infected with COVID. So you've got an enormous confounders all over the place here, which I think making claims of enormous harm are difficult. And I understand that doesn't mean you shouldn't look at them and you shouldn't deal with them. But I think that there's too much hyperbole, if you like, on both sides. But you've got to get people to listen. And I think you start off by
hold that thought, Dr. Kendrick, because I simply have to get to a break. But we're going to continue with this. We're going to pick up this conversation again with Claire Craig, Jasmine, and Dr. Kendrick after the break. Bear with us. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Still with me, Dr. Claire Craig and Jasmine Birtles. There are so many facets to this story around what happened to us in the time of COVID. And ultimately, it's a story about people, what was done to people, what happened to people. And we're now going to speak to Alison Walker, who says harsh lockdown policies in Scotland led to her parents suffering, especially from isolation during the COVID pandemic. Alison gave evidence to the Scottish COVID inquiry, and her parents, Sandy and Olive, are still in a care home in Glasgow. Thanks for joining us, Alison.
Thanks for having me on, Neil. Good to be here.
Tell us what happened. It always comes down to people. What happened to individuals and what happened to your parents?
Yeah, Mum and Dad, dementia is a cruel and tortuous disease. And when the lockdown first started, I knew straight away the impact that it would have on Mum and Dad, especially my mum, who wasn't quite as advanced in her dementia as my dad. She still was able to get out and about and go out for coffee and interact. And the key was being part of the family. The key to keeping somebody relatively stable with dementia, which is a dreadful disease, is family life, is contact, is human touch, is mixing with people, is stimulation. You remove that, then you know the disease is just going to escalate beyond belief. So I knew at the start of lockdown that this was going to be really, really, really disastrous for my parents. I got the panic at the start from the two governments, Scotland and England. I got it slightly, and then I thought after a month, this cannot continue. So I've been campaigning more or less since, March 2020 to make sure that we got in to see them, to reestablish that vital contact. And to be honest, it just went from bad to worse. And now my parents, they're in a sorry state. They have no idea who anybody is. They just hang their heads. It's the most dreadful disease at the best of times, and then the worst thing that could happen to them happened to them. And I know if I was to have the conversation with them pre-COVID and I said, would you rather not have family or be locked away so you didn't get COVID? I know what they would choose. They would rather die.
It's desperately upsetting, and the images there, the transformation that your folks have gone through is well, it's only heartbreaking to look on at that. What was the difference that was imposed upon you? Pre-COVID, were you able to be just in daily contact with them so that you were able to keep all the ties that bind intact?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, dementia is a chronic condition. You're going to get worse anyway. But it was all about trying to stabilise my mum in particular, and we kept her stable, and she knew the family members. So, I took her swimming, I took her to ballet classes, I took her for coffees. We interacted with lots of members of the family. So, I knew how important it was. I worked so hard at keeping her stable. And then this kicked in, and I thought, well, maybe the lockdown's not going to be too long. And then it went on for 2+ years. Plus, she's deaf, Neil, and she relied on lip reading to communicate. And of course, they were all wearing masks around her. So she's lost the ability to even speak. She just makes noises now. And I'll give an example of the impact on my dad. I got called in April 2021 because they thought he was end of life. I hadn't seen him for months. He can't communicate on any technology. So he's 90, and his brain has really affected him badly. So I got called in. I got called into his room. I had to be fully suited up. As soon as I got into the room, I ripped everything off. And my dad was lying there, grey, barely breathing. I don't know what death looks like. I've never encountered it before. And I thought, is this it? I was all by myself. Nobody else, other family members weren't allowed in. And, I put my hand under the covers and I grabbed his hand, and it was warm. And I said, Dad, if you know me and you feel me, squeeze my hand. And he did. He squeezed my hand and his eyes flickered. And I saw him put his tongue out and he licked his lips and he opened his eyes and he looked at me. And I said, do you need a drink, Dad? And I got him a drink and helped him drink it. And from that day onwards, he perked up and he's still with us. Now, that for me indicates the power and the hope of family. And that was taken away from thousands and thousands of residents in care homes, and a huge breach of human rights, which the Scottish COVID inquiry has just confirmed, that the adverse effect on residents' physical and mental well-being outweighed the risk posed by COVID-19. Multiple breaches of human rights have now been confirmed. Article 8, the right to family life, and the threshold of degrading and inhumane treatment contained in Article 3 has also been met. None of this surprises the family members, Neil. We knew this, and yet we pummeled the government with information and evidence, and neither government did anything about it. And the result is thousands died, probably more through isolation, lack of contact because they gave up. And, the rest of this, loads of thousands of, like my mum and dad now, who are in a terrible state as a result of the lockdown policies.
Alison, bear with me. Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, you're still with us. I think it's harrowing testimony, surely. As a society, we have to... That's just one example. It's just one family. And if proof were needed about how much was wrong...
Well, I think that the lockdown policies in care homes was I believe brutal in the extreme. In fact, I can use the example of my own mother, who is not demented, but her view was essentially, I've lived long enough, and getting locked down is terrible and isolating, and I'd rather catch COVID and die. Personally, I mean, I realise that's just one reflection, but I think nobody asked, and the care home staff were being allowed to work in different care homes and move from one to the other, and they were sending patients in from hospital with known COVID. So the whole lockdown thing just seems to have been, it's hard to describe the words for it. So I'm in total agreement here that this was an extraordinary and destructive actions that were carried out, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Dr. Kendrick. Claire, a last word from you. I mean, surely, my goodness, we need hope. The hope accord. I mean, when you hear testimony from Alison Walker about her mum and dad, and a GP in the front line, acknowledging harm's done, do we have hope that we can deal with these things in a more humane, ethical way?
Well, we can't deal with them in a less humane, ethical way. So, yes, that's where the hope lies. There's only one way we can go with this. And I would just like to say that in terms of the care homes, in winter of 2021, with the second wave, there was a study from Cambridge University where they showed that the various variants that were in the Cambridge community were all present in test results from care home residents because it spreads through the air. So none of these lockdowns and restrictions did anything to help these people. It was all harm. And the other thing I'd say regarding the cardiovascular risk is that what we've seen is there used to be 2,000 daily ambulance calls for life-threatening emergencies. And we now see 2,500. And it was a change that happened in spring 2021. It was and that is when it happened. So I agree that there were other factors, as in, the psychological harms of lockdown were real. And we saw a rise in cardiovascular deaths in young people in autumn of 2020, because that is real. But the vaccines clearly are a big part of that story.
Thank you, Dr. Clare. Craig, thanks, Jasmine, as well for your contribution. Thank you, Alison Walker. That your testimony goes right to the heart of it. And thank you, GP Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. It's only time that has forced us to bring this fascinating, harrowing conversation to a close. It's another break, after which WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, a free man, as he bids to rebuild his life. I'll be speaking to the co-founder of Wikipedia, Larry Sanger. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, here's something I wasn't expecting to say, possibly ever, but Julian Assange is a free man and he has landed back home in his native Australia. For the past 14, 15 years, Assange has been in a legal battle with US officials who accused him of leaking classified documents, which they say put lives in danger. But after a plea deal, he left his London prison cell behind earlier this week. To discuss this, I'm joined by the co-founder of Wikipedia, Larry Sanger, a man as concerned as I am with all matters relating to freedom and freedom of speech. Larry Sanger, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's good to be back with you.
This is, if there was an iconic figure in terms of the threats that are being brought to bear upon freedom of speech. I think for a lot of people, Julian Assange would be that individual. What do you think we learn from this development now?
Well, I think they didn't want to give Donald Trump a win by Assange being freed under his watch. Over the last 5 years or so, Assange has grown from being basically a just libertarian hero to being really a hero of press freedom and basically freedom from tyranny all around the world. So freeing him, and so really his arrest, his persecution was it was a strike by the deep state against those who would try to properly oversee it.
Do you think would there be any cause for concern? I mean, obviously we don't know the full nature of the plea deal or whatever was arrived at in order for Julian Assange to get out of Belmarsh. Are there any? Should we be worried about any of that? You know, this idea, will it have discouraged anyone from ever again having the temerity, so to speak, to publish classified documents?
Yeah, that certainly is a concern. But, I actually think there's enough really bold, passionate journalists out there still that this isn't over. I do think, in fact, that there are possibly Julian himself will continue, and others will continue. I think the fact that he had to spend so much time in prison for the crime of journalism, basically, that in itself was the great damage done to press freedom, frankly. The fact that he has gotten out and was sentenced to time served, well, I think that actually that is a qualified win, I would think. But still, I mean, it's a shame that he ended up having any sentence imposed on them at all.
Larry Sanger, I'm just short of time this evening, but thank you so much. We will speak again on related matters sometime very soon. Thank you, Larry Sanger. Jasmine, what was your reaction to what's happened here? There's so much being said about Julian Assange, about the case. What was your response to this sudden news?
Well, like Larry, I think there's been a shift of thought, and it's been a political hot potato. Nobody wanted to be the ones to be seen to be against freedom. And I think there's been a massive shift of thought amongst the public worldwide in the last few years. And I'm an example of it, because I remember at first when Assange came out, he was attacked for what he'd done. I thought, oh, this is terrible. He's exposed all sorts of spies and etc. And then gradually I realised, no, what he'd done was exposed what various American presidents had done, the wars, the warmongering, all this wickedness. So I then became somebody who stood with banners outside of the courts.
You've been there and fought the fight.
Yeah, I have.
Jasmine, thank you so much for just now. That's it for the Neil Oliver Show on TV this week. That's the end of the TV hour. But there's plenty more coming online at gbnews.com, so you know where to be for the rest. I'll be continuing the discussions with more guests and always in the company of my fabulous panellist, Jasmine Birtles. Good evening and welcome along to the second hour of the Neil Oliver Show, where we have a chance to take a breath, have a longer, more in-depth conversation. I can bring in more guests and give them time to contemplate and think. It's less of a rush. Amongst other things, we'll be asking what reports of Saudi Arabia letting the 50-year-long petrodollar agreement with the US expire could mean for the future of the US dollar itself. Could this lead to a new monetary world order? Molly Kingsley from Us For Them will be here to discuss whether general election voters are feeling let down by both of the main parties, I know I am, due to lack of integrity in politics. We'll also hear from Ralph Schulhammer, very much a friend of the show, contemplating this week whether normal people are starting to feel silenced by a system they no longer control. To discuss all of that and plenty more is journalist and personal finance expert Jasmine Birtles. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. I'll start this second hour by discussing reports that Saudi Arabia is going to let the 50-year petrodollar agreement with the United States expire. Is the US dollar going to be able to remain the global reserve currency, or are we all, as a planet, looking at something new in the monetary realm, with commodity-backed money potentially returning? Here to discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by Andy Schechtman, President and owner of Miles Franklin Precious Metals. I am genuinely delighted to see you, Andy Schechtman. Thank you for joining us.
Well, the pleasure is mine. Thank you for the invitation. It's fantastic.
This story, Andy, absolutely preoccupies me. I became aware of the petrodollar, and I thought it was of huge significance, especially around what was happening in relation to Saudi Arabia. But many, even economists and economy-minded people that I talked to, tried to tell me that there is no such thing as a petrodollar. And there clearly is. So can you, for the beginners, really like myself and others out there, can you give a sense of what the petrodollar is and why it matters?
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. The petrodollar has given the United States the ability to live far beyond its means for a very long time. It was a deal that was struck in 1974, 50 years ago, just a few weeks ago, whereby, in essence, for a condition of protection and military assistance with the Saudi kingdom and by extension OPEC, for valuing oil in dollars globally and recycling any excess in U.S. treasuries, the Saudi kingdom was granted protection from the United States military. And it's been that way literally for 50 years, which has created a massive synthetic demand for the U.S. dollar. In other words, every single country on the planet has had to stockpile dollars in order to buy oil, where nearly 100% of all the oil sales over the last 50 years have been done in US dollars. It is a massive deal. Amongst other things, of course, Saudi Arabia joining BRICS, the BRICS New Development Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And what really got me on this path almost 4 years ago was the realization that every single OPEC country, Saudi Arabia included, is on the Belt Road Initiative. Conspicuously, the West is not. And I would just simply say this is just another nail in the coffin. I call it logarithmic decay, little by little by little by little by little, then bang, all at once. Now, we haven't seen that all at once moment yet, but certainly you could argue the fuse has been lit in that Saudi Arabia now has carte blanche, really, to trade with whomever they want in whatever currency they want for oil without having it to be literally exclusively in US dollars. Big deal.
Why is it happening now?
I think there are several reasons that it's happening now, but the biggest reason of all would be the weaponization of the dollar and the treasury. The United States is viewed by many in the Southern Hemisphere, Neil, as being hypocritical, where Janet Yellen can say to CNN, listen, we're okay with Putin and Xi being friends. Well, thank you very much, Madam Secretary. That's fantastic and benevolent of you, were my first thoughts on that. She said, but if one penny is given to the Russian war machine, we will sanction your banks, your companies in Beijing itself. Never mind the fact that we've given $260 billion to the Ukraine with nary a hair of congressional oversight, including Javelin missiles, F-16s, and the intelligence on where to drop it, where we can go into Iraq 20 years ago. Now, granted, I love this country. I'm a patriot, but what I see is happening breaks my heart. We can go into Iraq 20 years ago under the guise of weapons of mass destruction and say, we're sorry, we didn't find any, but we're still here. We've destroyed your country, really, and we'll help you rebuild it, of course, with our American companies. And but we put in a new regime, and yet we're still here. And sanctioning 20 or 14 of your banks right now for having the audacity to try to buy liquid natural gas using Iranian banks, which were on the do not trade list. And you know, they made $90 billion in oil revenue in 2023. They asked for $1 billion towards the end of the year, and the United States said, not a good time, come back to us in 24. What they have done as a result is formally apply to the BRICS. They are in the process of kicking Western coalition forces out of the country. They have made trading in dollars illegal. If you own a business and trade in dollars, high probability you'll end up in prison and your business taken. And as of January 1st, of 2024, there are no green dollar bills in any of the banks in Iraq anymore. In other words, half of the world views us as hypocritical, where we can go around the world making these declarations, these sanctions, and let's just call it what it is. We have confiscated $5 billion in the Russian assets. Now, in your neck of the woods, in the European Union, and I don't know exactly how the UK fits into this, but the European Union has 260 or 70 or 80 billion worth of Russian assets. They've agreed to steal just the interest. In both cases, whether it's the U.S. stealing $5 billion worth of U.S. treasuries, or taking the 280 billion, the interest from it, and using it to buy weapons to give to the Ukraine, the country that you stole from, you're giving the weapons to the country they're fighting in a war. That's a line you cross and you'll never come back from. It is the weaponization of the dollar, the weaponization of the treasury, from what appears to be by many a hypocritical position, and it is not going over well, to say the least. And let's not forget, you know, the United States is creating $1 trillion of debt every 100 days. $1 trillion seconds ago, Neil, was 31,688 years ago. It took us 200 years to do it the first time. We're destroying the value of the dollar through the printing press. And, you know, it's a situation that is just unattainable with the continued debasement of the dollar and weaponization of the treasury. The United States is not looked at the way they once were by many of these countries, Saudi Arabia included.
Andy, hold that thought for a second. Jasmine Birtles, it's an extraordinary story.
It is.
I feel hasn't attracted anything like the amount of attention that it ought to have. This is the world swinging on a hinge.
Absolutely.
moving.
Yeah, it's massive. I mean, I agree with Andy and you. It's a huge story. And the whole idea of the dollar as the reserve currency of the world is evaporating in front of our eyes. As you know, the dollar's been the reserve currency for decades, replacing the pound, boo. And these things do have, I mean, it's a cyclical thing. But as Andy says, by confiscating Russian assets, they've basically, I think that plus, the loss of Saudi Arabia, that has just completely cut themselves off and really meant that I think we've just got a few years left now, if that, of the reserve currency being the dollar, because other countries are looking going, oh, so if we do anything against the United States, they could take all of our assets, could they? However, the question next is what would be the next reserve currency? And I'd be interested to hear what Andy says about this, because it seems to me that we're going into a multipolar world. There isn't one particular currency, including the yen, I think, that would necessarily take over from the dollar.
Andy Shepard, what would be your estimate on the likelihood of there being another replacement reserve currency, or, as Jasmine suggests, will it be a more of a free-for-all?
Well, I think, first of all, to talk about Saudi Arabia without speaking of the BRICS is a mistake. There was just a meeting in Novograd, Russia, where 59 countries have formally applied to the BRICS on top of the 10 that are already there. And, this meeting had 21,000 attending in 139 nations. And much of what we've seen over the last year was talked about here too, and that's $80 billion of bilateral deals done on the sidelines. Mm. So let's first say the first step of the I guess you could say the trouble associated with the petrodollar would be the fact that their settlement is done in all of these local currencies. We've been seeing this nonstop where, Saudi Arabia is selling their oil to China for yuan, which is immediately convertible into gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. And you have to understand that gold was reclassified by the Bank of International Settlements in 2019 as the world's only other tier 1 reserve asset. We could have another discussion about Gordon Brown and what he did with all of your gold. Mm. But the point of it is that the world is now looking at gold, in my opinion, as a replacement for the Treasury bond. And if you go back to 2000, go back for the last almost 25 years, gold has doubled the performance of the 10-year Treasury, while at the same time is an asset that has no counterparty liability. And this is why you're seeing the central banks of the world not only massively accumulate gold, but also, like the Bank of India just did, purchasing 1.5 times the amount of gold in the first 4 months of this year as they did all of last year. But they repatriated that gold and all of the gold held at the Bank of England, over 100 metric tons, because it's not just looking at gold, which has no counterparty liability and has averaged over 9.9% per year for the last 25 years, but repatriating it, which is an indictment of the system. So what I'm getting at is this new BRICS system. In fact, they just announced last week, the head of the BRICS New Development Bank, Dilma Rousseff, had all sorts of meetings with Putin, and it was announced publicly that they have agreed upon a new settlement currency, which will be called the unit. And that unit will be backed 40% by gold, which is what? The only other tier 1 reserve asset that the central banks have been buying at a level the world has never seen. And I'll tell you, they use the suppression of the gold market on the London Metals Exchange and on the COMEX, which are trading many, many, many multiples of the ounces of gold that they hold in order to, and have been for a long time, to maintain a certain price level to make the Western system seem better than it is. But when these exchanges were designed, these countries in the Southern Hemisphere didn't have the coordination, sophistication, or wealth to stand for delivery. And that's what we are seeing now that's going to change the system. So when you look at the way that these countries, oh, by the way, and 60% of the unit will be BRICS plus currencies. So they're using something called the Project M Bridge, which has been a joint development between China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the United Arab Emirates. And it is a platform that sidestepped the SWIFT so that there is no ability to sanction these trades. And what it is the ability for these countries to trade in local currencies, right? So they're all going to have their own central bank digital currencies using the Project M-Bridge, but there will be one common settlement currency for the BRICS Union, which as it is right now, you guys, represents the majority of human population, larger swath of global GDP, 2 of the 3 largest nuclear arsenals in the world, way more of the commodities, way more in the shipping lanes, whether it be the Red Sea or the Straits of Hormuz, and on and on and on. And it is a growing union where these countries are finding safety in numbers and a rallying cry pushing against the West. So it will be settlement in local currencies, which chips away at the settlement value of the dollar, and then settling in things or reinvesting the proceeds in things like gold or oil, which I believe across the globe are being remonetized in favor of a treasury which can be weaponized. And if we don't like what you're doing, never mind what we're doing, but if we don't like what you're doing, hey, we're going to take it from you. And we might even give it to the country you're in the midst of a war with to buy weapons and fire them back at you. This is something that is bigger than people think. And, you know, the real truth of it is, you guys, and I give you a lot of kudos and respect, because over here, the media doesn't do a poor job of telling us what's going on. They do no job. And most of the people in this country have no idea that the dollar, why the dollar has been the world reserve currency. They don't know that gold has jumped alongside of it as the only other tier 1 reserve asset. They don't see what is happening. But this growing coalition of countries is something to not, I think, take lightly, and to dismiss it as a mistake.
And one of the things that strikes me as extraordinary about it is that I was kind of raised, we're all raised that you see America as the policeman of the world, the good guys, the cowboys in white hats. And yet, in this instance, what's happening here, everyone else, the BRICS nations and all of those prospective members of that entity in the North-South corridor, everyone else is behaving like grown-ups. Everyone else is setting aside all sorts of differences and ideological, divisions and getting on with the business of building and creating. And somehow America has been left has just been left behind.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. Even mentioning the North-South corridor, there's probably not a person in this country that understands what that is. But these shipping lanes and trade routes are all integral to the Belt Road Initiative as an example. The Belt Road Initiative is the largest infrastructure project in human history, connecting Asia, Africa, South America, and parts of Europe. It represents 75% of human population as it is right now, 50% of global GDP. It's bridges and roads and maritime channels and railways that will be patrolled nothing but by commerce and military. You add that into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the operative word here is cooperation. To your point, there is no coercion. They're cooperating with one another. And the Eurasian Economic Union, which the president of Belarus said, let's get them all into the BRICS. I've been saying that for 3 years and over 3,000 videos I've done on this topic. And that is exactly what is happening. It is a cooperative endeavor where these countries are aligning and putting aside ideological differences because my enemy's enemy is my friend. And I think they realize they have one shot. Look, all of us in the West have ruled the roost for 500 years. And these countries, which have never had a chance to speak on their own, are finding safety and coordination and sophistication together. And it is representing a trend that when it's all said and done, if you put all those groups together, and they are in essence the same groups, the Belt Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, by the way, Iran and Saudi Arabia have joined. It is the largest regional financial and military organization on the planet. Along with the Eurasian Economic Union, the Belt Road, you're talking 85 to 90% of human population and the majority of all the commodities. There's a man named Zoltan Pozsar, who is one of the smartest guys I've ever known. He used to work at the New York Fed. He works at UBS now. He talks about where we are in this system. Now, to your associates' point, the dollar, which took over for the pound sterling, did so at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at the end of World War II. That was Bretton Woods 1. Bretton Woods 2 would loosely be when we became the petrodollar in June of 1974. And now he says we've entered a new system called Bretton Woods 3. And that will be based upon transparency and commodities. And if you look at what these countries are all doing, they are finding value in commodities. I would argue that oil is being remonetized as well. Iran just had their largest airport. They awarded a contract to China to have their largest airport remodeled. couple $1 billion will pay for it in oil. These countries understand that he or she, it used to be he who has the gold makes the rules. Now it's going to be he or she who has the commodities makes the rules. Right along with Saudi Arabia, you have China who bought the London Metals Exchange, which is all the base metals, copper and lead and zinc and whatnot. They're buying up commodities all around the world in a cooperative manner. They come in, they industrialize, they help these countries enhance their middle class and bring their natural resources to the market and all the benefits that come with it in a cooperative manner. And Saudi Arabia, I think, has decided, not to mention, our president signs an executive order to go green. There's one piece that I'd like to mention real quick, and hopefully I'm not hurting you with time, but the lead economic advisor to the United States government is a knucklehead named Jared Bernstein. And Jared Bernstein's entire thesis, believe it or not, is to lose the world reserve currency. It's a privilege we can no longer afford. Mm-hmm. He's written all sorts of reports about it, the most famous being Dethrone King Dollar. But if you realize weaponizing the dollar, signing an executive order to go green, that is a hell of a good start to pushing Saudi Arabia out of this hegemony fold that has been for 50 years and into a new group that is providing safety and security in numbers, and they're not going green the way that we are.
No.
Andy Sheckman, as far as I'm concerned, this is the biggest story in the world. It beggars belief for me that more people aren't preoccupied with it. And thank you. I can't thank you enough for helping me to better understand it. And I'll look forward to picking this up with you another time because this is a story that's just going to develop and develop. Thank you, Andy Sheckman. Jasmine, yeah. It's huge. The world, you can feel the world shifting. You can feel the tectonic plates moving under your feet.
Well, it really is. And as Andy says, it does seem like a deliberate attempt by those that are running the United States, whoever that is, to dethrone the dollar, absolutely. And that has massive implications for the whole of the West, not just the USA.
It's curiouser and curiouser.
Yeah.
The more you dig, the rabbit hole just drops out from under you again and again and again. It's another break, after which Molly Kingsley from the campaign group Us For Them will be here to talk about some very interesting polling which suggests the main parties, Conservative and Labour, are perceived by the public as lacking honesty and integrity. I wonder where that notion came from and what they could do to change that. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GBNews. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My next guest is the co-founder of the campaigning group Us For Them, Molly Kingsley. And the group have been doing some polling which suggests that as we approach the election, both main parties are perceived by the public as lacking honesty and integrity. Kind of like, it's almost a broadcast from the Department of the Blindly Obvious. Who would have thought that no one believes Labour and Conservative? But dig into it for us.
Yeah, and on some level, the polling confirms what we all probably knew, that the voters were at their wits' end, that actually were kind of sick of the lies and the dishonesty. There were a couple of really interesting insights that were gleaned out of it, though. So one of them was that the key driver of how we will vote in the election for most of us is factored around the cost of living, tax rises, the economy. And
like real things for real people?
Real things for real people. And of course, politicians in the mainstream media have been doing their best to attribute that to anything but their own decision and anything but the Ukraine war and the pandemic. And actually, it turns out that a majority of voters see through that. So 60% of people, give or take, see the cost of living crisis, tax rises, the economy as being driven by pandemic debt. Now, that's certainly not something that, we're seeing politicians own up to. Because of that, surprise, surprise, we're losing faith in, politicians and the messages they're giving us. And the other really interesting thing that this polling revealed is that, having come from a place where those of us who had been raising alarm bells about, the speed of the vaccine rollout, possible harms, excess deaths, what was driving that, we were called conspiracy theorists. It's felt like a very lonely place to be for a long time, Neil. You will understand that. Well, it turns out that 50% of us now say we would be more likely to vote for a party that would hold an independent inquiry into excess deaths. That's big, I think, right?
Especially because, with a few honourable exceptions, nobody on the green benches, they all scuttle away into wherever it is they scuttle away to, whenever anyone raises the spectre of there's too many people dying.
Yes.
Won't talk about it.
Yeah, no, and so we have this odd thing, don't we? We've got the disconnect between what, real people are saying away from the media and maybe in our own homes in the pub, and what the media are talking about, which is, by and large, is very staid party lines, left, right, all on very traditional.
Jasmine, I'm thinking, we were listening to Dr. Claire Craig at the top of the show. The Hope Accord, which is, demanding all sorts withdrawal of the mRNA products and so on, but also about a return to ethics, a return to integrity within the health profession. It chimes, doesn't it?
Doesn't it?
Across the board.
Yes.
In our society, the people are crying out for
honesty,
God's sake,
and
tell us
ethics.
the truth.
Yes, exactly. And I think this also is one of the things that is powering what's called the populist movements, populist parties, because they seem at least to say what the ordinary people are saying and thinking. And as you say, the main parties, wherever you are, in Europe, in the USA, in this country, they are not saying these things. So the media is screaming about sort of far right, etc. But what real people are saying is, at least they are saying what we're thinking, and at least they seem to be sincere. And that's sort of what's being said about Farage, for example, that people say, well, he says it as it is. None of the other parties, or certainly the big parties, are not. So this seems to be what's powering the popularity at the moment.
Molly, what Jasmine's touching on there is what I've begun to wonder. You've been doing polling, and we're hearing, the last thing I looked at said, that Reform might get 18 seats. But I'm wondering if something much, much bigger might be bubbling about. I'm thinking all the way back to the Brexit vote, the biggest plebiscite in history. Is there any indication that, far from a low turnout, there might actually be a lot of people turning out to vote because they've really got a point they want to make? And are we getting anything like the truth from the way the media is covering the run-up to this election?
No, you do wonder, don't you? Because I certainly don't remember another election where there has been so much outrage. People are so angry. And actually, when you're angry, you may stay away from the polls, but I think a lot of people will go and protest vote. And I think it is unfortunate, actually, that we are not seeing more from some of the non-mainstream parties. We have seen a bit from Reform and Farage, but it's been quite limited. And there are other parties there too. I read the SDP manifesto the other day. It is fantastic. It is brilliant. It is common sense. It has these innovative, grounded policies that actually, were they to happen, would really change this country. Ditto Reform. I don't agree with everything they're saying, but I think they are a breath of fresh air, and I respect their frank talking. And it would be good to see more of them. And yet, particularly the right-wing media, curiously, seem very intent on smearing Farage. And
why? Both of you, why doesn't someone ride this wave? It seems to me that there's such a wave of public fury or indignation, at the very least. And at the moment, the only person who's seeking to harness it is Nigel Farage. It would appear.
Weird.
Why aren't they all trying to ride this wave? Why can't they do it?
It is an odd one, because I think maybe they're all feeling too small. And what I'm thinking is that we need to get these smaller parties, as you say, to work together. I think together they could ride the wave. They would have the bandwidth to get onto it. But they're all, again, it's like you were saying earlier in the programme, that you've got too many people working against, or organisations working against each other. Whereas if they did it together, they could really ride this wave and make a difference.
And it's interesting we say they, I would say there is no they. No one's going to save us. We need to get active in our own rescue. We need to be riding this wave. And all of us that have been sitting here on our sofas, mouthing off, we need to get involved, and we need to make it happen.
I'm also very aware of, you came into this, or us for them, it's about children. To say they're foundational and fundamental to human life is an understatement. And also, so much of it seems to be coming from people's concern about health. We've been hearing about the Scottish COVID inquiry and the dreadful mistreatment of people in care homes and all of the rest of it. society has got right down to the basics, hasn't it? You talked about the cost of living crisis, people that can't put food on the table, that can't, they can no longer afford their homes. All of it has got right down to very basic stuff. And yet floating above it are the two main parties who still seem to be preoccupied with talking a lot of rubbish about things that nobody's interested in.
They do. I mean, actually, you mentioned children, and it's really good you do, because it's interesting how little children have been mentioned in this. And actually, I didn't hear all of the debate from America last night, but the bits I have heard, I haven't heard one mention of the word child. And it's so saddening, because, why are we here as a species if not for our children?
And who took the brunt of everything that happened in the last 4 years in terms of lockdown, in terms of closures of schools and everything else, and isolation from extended family, and everything to do with the products pushed as vaccines and all of the rest of it? It was kids.
It was kids.
And we've had, we've had colleagues of yours on talking about fundamentals that kids can't speak. They can't speak.
And all these hollow promises that during the pandemic were rolled out. I mean, we had, what was it today? There was 1.5 billion has now been written off. Was that right? I don't know if I've got the right figure on PPE. Now, do you remember the education recovery programme that they wouldn't fund? They funded 1.4 and they kind of did it, through gritted teeth and not really wanting to. And you think, really, that was what kids were worth, a load of discarded PPE?
And it does seem to be with political parties, and very much with the Tories, that they are courting the elderly, the older people who are the voters, and just really ignoring the young. As you say, pathetic amounts being put into education, really pathetic. Very little help and support to young people, not just children, but younger people in trying to start their lives, trying to start businesses, trying to start in the workspace. And so much of this is driven by who's going to vote, and that is generally the older people.
Do you get a sense when you've been the polling, we're being threatened with a poor turnout, or we have been? What do you think? Or are people going to be galvanised against the predictions to get out and vote?
I mean, I hope so. I think you do wonder whether it's been left quite late. And although, Farage, like him or hate him, he certainly galvanised this debate. I suspect there will be people that will be put off reform, actually, because of him. Because, Tice was doing very well, I think many people thought, and, certainly had come up with some quite bold policies. And we seem to be back now to this world of sort of almost cult populism. And that has a downside and it has a danger. And I think, personally, I would like to see a much greater shake-up of our political duopoly, so that we are talking about new entrants, political parties, new voices, not just a voice. So I think this will be a start, but only a start. And actually, really, we have to look to 2029. And those of us that maybe might end up feeling a bit frustrated by what happens this year.
You never know, though. It could be earlier. And also, though, on the negative side, what I think is a negative is I am coming across quite a lot of people who are ideologically not going to vote because they don't believe in the whole system now. It's not just Conservative, Labour, Reform, SDP, whatever. It's just the whole alleged democratic system. They see that as something that has just had its day.
That's where I am.
Well, I understand.
I just feel as if it's a toxic goldfish bowl, and I don't want anything to do with it. The whole thing just feels poisoned and corrupted to me. It's like, just get rid of that.
And so then what would you do? What about if we had a candidate here like Kennedy in America, say, who is preparing to take that on?
Yes. Well, I mean, I find I don't agree with everything that he says. I'm frustrated by his, taking that, the stance that he's taken just about, Israel always right, everybody else always wrong. And I thought, oh God, could there not just have been a candidate finally that would have handled that in the way that so many people feel that enough's enough. But I'm preoccupied with the family. I'm preoccupied with kids. To get back to that, I have people on here all the time talking about we're not replacing ourselves. The birth rates and fertility and all of the rest of it are through the floor. Where is the party that will prioritise kids and family?
SDP. It's there. So, I mean, read their manifesto, I would say that. And they have a provision in their manifesto which is every policy to be looked at through the lens of its impact on family life. They also have a whole load of sensible things like tax credits for families. They have, I think they're saying, 3 days working from home for parents with kids under the age of 5. That there'll be business contingents that kind of look at that and say, oh, it's not very business and bad for the city. Absolutely brilliant for families, life-changing for those of us with young kids.
I would be all about that. I would listen. My ears would prick up right away if somebody said everything about making and raising a family is going to be made easier. That's where the tax benefits are going to be. That's where all of the incentives are going to go. And I can't think of anyone in my vicinity that wouldn't be all over that.
Yeah, quite. And
it's a no-brainer.
It is, and I do think this is where the two main parties have completely detached themselves from reality. And the good thing about it is I'm hearing the SDP manifesto and the Reform manifesto, and certainly the Heritage Party, is that they are for families, and that's what most people want. Even if you haven't got a family, you like family values, supporting marriage.
Reform is very good on that as well, isn't it? And also for culture and for our heritage, I think all of them.
And then you've got other parties that don't know what a woman is and, are all for transgender. There's this sort of tiny minority of people who are not really, this is not what most people care about and want. And for them is important. It is, as you say, the cost of living crisis. It's the breakup of family units, not enough support for family, all of these things. And basic honesty and integrity. And again, family values tend to say to me, honesty, integrity, basic Judeo-Christian values, which we all really fundamentally want. Even if you're not a churchgoer and you don't believe in it, you want those values at least.
To change the subject slightly, but I've had your colleagues in talking about the impact of technology on kids, and up to and including the fact that it's impairing the uptake of learning to speak. That's another fundamental as well. I go about all the time now watching people in that posture with their phones. I'm as guilty as anyone of it. But you realise that everyone is doing it. We have made ourselves addicted to something that's more addictive than nicotine, more addictive than cocaine. This is the one, this tech, and yet what have we done? We've given it to 3-year-olds, or some people have.
And we try and complain, we try and say but it's their right to have a phone. It's their right to be on social media. I mean, it's very odd, the kind of mental gymnastics that people do to justify the decision. There's some very interesting polling, actually, that's been done on this, not by us, but what it shows is that a vast majority of parents who haven't already given their kids smartphones are against children having smartphones and are pro an outright ban effectively on smartphones. Of course, for the parents that have already given the kids a smartphone, it is still a majority, but it's a much less persuasive majority who would support a restriction. But again, this is one of those things, like, the answer is there. It is obvious. We just need bold politicians to do it. We don't have to ban children from having all phones. We just need a licensed product that is safe and is stripped back. Like, this is not rocket science, and it just needs to happen. But we need politicians who are prepared to, rock things up a bit.
And also, sorry, as you were saying, we need us individually to step up to the plate, ultimately, because
we do.
Let's be honest, politicians are human beings like us. There's only so much they can do, even the good ones. So we individually need to start moving and shaking and taking things into our own hands, because it's amazing what can be done from grassroots.
It is, absolutely. There's a great movement, actually, the smartphone-free childhood movement, who are doing really, really great things in this space. And it just shows how much parents do care about this.
The extent, it seems to me, to which the main political parties certainly have just simply, somehow or other, taken their eye off of everything that real people care about. And they've drifted away from the rest of there's 650 of them, and they have just drifted off into some sort of nether kingdom where the things they care about have no bearing on the lives of people. Stay with me, Molly, if you will. I'm just going to bring in my last guest of the evening, but it's not disconnected from what we've been talking about so far. That guest in question is Ralph Schulhammer, who's very familiar to those of you who are followers of the Neil Oliver Show. He's there with us now, and we're going to discuss his new theory that normal people are feeling silenced by a system they no longer control. A pleasure yet again to see you, Ralph. And we have Molly Kingsley from Us For Them, Jasmine Birtles, and I think you're in terrain that we can all share.
Well, I'm so happy to be with all of you. It's a great honor and a great pleasure. And if I may, maybe contribute a little bit to what you were just discussing. I agree with all three of you. I would just add one quick thing, which is I don't think that public policy and taxation can really incentivize people to have families again. I give you one example. The founder of Singapore, like Lee Kuan Yew, he had a great description about Great Britain in the 1960s. And he described the Britain, I know this sounds very nostalgic, so bear with me, but he described Britain as a society, right? High trust society. Neighbors trusting each other, neighbors helping each other, right? Community, where you say, my God, that's a society in which I want to have children. I think that factor is so important. If you want people to have families, they must be part of society they want to see continued. And what we see is an epidemic of despair, right? Talk to people, everybody says the future is going to be worse than today, right? Can I really have children in this world? And I think that really blocks many people from having families. And the second thing is what we have done. I believe we have incentivized vice and disincentivized virtue. Yeah. And I don't mean this in a kind of abstract way. I mean it in the sense of, if you're a family, if you're a mother, that's a great thing, right? That's awesome. That's the greatest thing, the greatest contribution to society. But we kind of treat it as an abnormality. I mean, I have friends that have 4 children, and I can see it when we're at public gatherings and somebody says, oh, I have my 4 kids at home. And you can really see how the temperature in the room drops and people say, 4 children? What's wrong with you? Why would anybody have 4 children? And if somebody says, I have no children, it's like, no children. Well, that's normal. And I think so we have to renormalize things that would help us to maintain a prosperous and also psychologically healthy society.
As well as, you're talking about people feeling disconnected. Too many people out there in society, don't feel that they're involved, that they're counted into anything, that they're not being invited to build towards anything. We're talking with Molly just in the last few minutes about the way in which the political class and all of the machinery that supports them have drifted away from people. They've drifted away from people, and they're not thinking about, caring about, or helping people build the things that ordinary people, ordinary families care about and want to invest in.
Yeah, I think that's true. But something that you guys said before, if you allow me to push back a little bit, that worries me so much. We saw something yesterday in the American presidential election, and I think that also applies to what we see in Britain and continental Europe, which is the mainstream media, most of them, this show, of course, is not part of this, they are lying to you, right? Remember, they told us that Joe Biden is the sharpest tool in the shed. Now we saw he wasn't, right? So they and what they do by this, exactly as Neil said, they push the population away. They this is a kind of form of blackmail. They want you to retreat from public discourse, because then the fringe takes over. One of your guests very accurately mentioned, for example, the whole transgender issue. Right? That's a minority issue. That's a very small percentage of the population. But if they are the ones who dominate the political discourse because they actively engage with the political discourse, they get disproportionate power. So I would ask your viewers, everybody who's listening to the show, go out and vote on July 4th. I cannot tell you, I'm a foreigner, I cannot do election interference from Austria, but vote for the party you think that is at least signaling that they're willing to make some changes, or a party that is kind of fires a shot against those, metaphorically, against the establishment. That would be both Labour and both the Tories. Don't retreat from the political process. You will not have a renaissance or a revolution if you go into inner exile. Go out and vote. It's a small act, but I'm telling you, it can make a difference.
Jasmine, that's a word that Ralph uses on here week in and week out, and I mean that in a good way, renaissance. And he also talks about renewal.
Yes.
And for me, rather than revolution, it's those other two R words, I think, that Ralph is right about.
Yes, I mean, there's another R word, revelation. A lot of people, particularly in the Christian tradition, are mentioning that we're in a time of revelation, and we certainly are. I mean, we've been talking about this, how all of us have seen things that we didn't see before 2020. Definitely, I mean, that's something. So I think when you get a new view of things, when things are revealed to you, that creates potentially a renaissance, a whole new thought. So, I mean, if I'm, one example, I can think of so very many things that I have completely changed my mind about. I mentioned Julian Assange earlier, that's just one small thing. So that has to produce some sort of renaissance, a new thought, a new birth. Renaissance means new birth. with this new revelation, certainly.
Do you feel that, Molly? Revelation? Do you feel? Have you been? I mean, I can echo that. You know, Jasmine saying has had her point of view about so many things changed in recent times. I have been completely altered, almost at the subatomic level over the last 4 years. Apocalypse gets a bad rap. People think it's the time of revelation. It's the time when things are revealed.
Yes.
I absolutely share that. I mean, I was not at all political 5 years ago, and I think I've been, certainly politicised, maybe radicalised on some level.
Yeah,
hopefully, though, that can be harnessed in a very positive way, because I think, as you said, Neil, like, we are at a moment in time when there are many of us who have woken up and actually who do see that this is not an acceptable form of doing politics and running a country. So, let's hope we can energise that and harness it.
Ralph, revelation, it does feel, or does that chime with you, this sense in which so many people are actually seeing the world anew on a kind of discovery?
I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, if you allow me, I know I'm a little bit hyperbolic here, but just a little bit. I think we do live in a kind of Soviet Union light. And what I mean by this is, for very long, we kind of had a feeling that the establishment is lying to us. And we participated in that lie, because as long as the economy was tuckering along, as long as our material conditions were okay-ish, or at least not getting significantly worse, right, we all participated in it, just in a way in which the people of the Soviet Union participated. But I think what COVID showed, what now the economic problems show, is that construct of lies, and I have no other way to describe it, is breaking down. Because this is very important also for me to kind of say, if you look at the positions of the quote-unquote extremist parties, they are the kind of positions that every mainstream politician from the 1960s to the 1980s was holding. We actually have radicals in government. Take something that Neil and I have been talking about a lot, net zero. That's a radical position. To say that the British economy should serve the British people is not a radical position. To say we cannot save Britain, but we can save the world, that's a radical position. To say we cannot protect the borders, but the very heavens, the weather, that we can change, that's a radical position. So we got it completely upside down. But we have governments very often that pursue delusional radical positions, and those who basically say, sometimes not as talented and rhetorically, well formulated as they should, but those who say, let's go back to sanity, those are the ones who are then blackmails as being the radicals. And I think this is what we have to do, you and Neil and all of us, all four of us, is kind of to exactly have this revelation to the people, to say, listen, you're not a radical. Like if you sign up for, whether it's family, patriotism, a merit-based system, an economy that works for everyone, and we can discuss in a different setting what that exactly means. I don't just want to sound off with platitudes, but those are not radical positions. But people are afraid to say them, and as you guys pointed out correctly before, so what they very often do is they retreat from the political system, because they say, this system is not working for me, I cannot change it anyways, I have this firewall of the media, academia, the cultural institutions, and the political class, I have no chance. My belief is you do have a chance, because politicians, companies, they're all opportunists. They believe that the radicals are in charge, which is why they pander to the radicals. If they see the quote-unquote normies have power, they will pander to the normies. I promise you that change is possible. We are at a turning point in history. The question is, will we support the turning, or will it be a turning point that refuses to turn? And I hope it's the former, not the latter.
Do you think all of this is symptomatic of what's happening in the West rather than in the rest of the world? One of my earlier guests this evening was Andy Schechtman. We were talking about the petrodollar, and that, of course, we drifted it then into conversation about realignment. We were talking about the North-South corridor through Iran. We were talking about the BRICS organisation or cooperation that's developing there. It feels like the rest of the world is getting on with straightforward things. Like business, like building, like creating, like cooperating. Unlike in the West, where we just seem to be either tearing ourselves apart or dissolving for want of some kind of innate cohesion anymore.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we see this. This is people very often like, and I do too, we very often like to use the term decadence. But I think what is the clearest sign of decadence is when the kind of the agenda setting parts of society, the quote unquote elites, are focusing on issues that only they can afford to focus on. For example, as we talked before, right, that is, I'm also for the environment, but I'm against environmentalism, right? I'm also for, protecting the climate, but I'm against net zero. I'm also for liberty in, kind of Oscar Wildean sense, but I don't think we should teach preschoolers the pleasures of, anal sex and all these other kind of things. But these are the signs of a truly decadent society. And of course, other societies that simply don't have the luxury, they don't have these problems. Take India, for example. Right? When Narendra Modi wakes up, he needs to take care of 1.8 billion people. He needs to hold a country together that is pretty much larger than the entire West taken together. And all what these people tell to him is say, we want to get wealthier, right? We want to have medical care, all these things that make life worth living. So he cannot engage in these kind of luxury problems that we have. Mm-hmm. And we need to realize that in order for us to maintain the prosperity we have to go back to the basics, all right? And the basics are, it's demographics, family on one hand, it's to make people understand that food does not just come from the supermarket, that energy does not come out of, the socket in the wall, money does not just come out of the ATM, that all these things need to be made. And I think once people realize that there is a real world out there that's not taking place on X, on Facebook, and, among the actors and celebrities, I think then we can get back on a course to normalcy. And the best way to get there, I believe, is that I would not allow anybody to run for public office who has not done an honest day's work in their life. And by this I mean work on a farm, work on an oil rig, work in a coal mine, do something with your hands. The world is an amazing place. The world we live in is an absolutely fascinating place. And we need to have some humility to understand where this came from and the previous generations who built all this, because that's another problem I think we have. My last point, I'm sorry, I'm monologuing, is that we have no respect towards previous generations who built all these things that we're living off. And that's also a sign of decadence, right? That you walk around and say, well, I'm so much better than everybody who came before me. No, you're not, because everything you enjoy nowadays is because those people before you were making great sacrifices.
Molly, when Ralph speaks, I think he articulates something very profound. Use of words like decadence, and the way that the things we're preoccupying ourselves with are just luxuries that other people cannot involve themselves with. It does all come back, doesn't it, to getting back to something fundamental?
It does, yeah. And I think you see this particularly actually in schools with the gender debate and the gender ideology. And if you just think about how much time we have spent debating that and how much time our politicians spend debating that, and actually schools should be about education. And, that has struck me, maybe not that word, but that concept of, something that is entirely this artificial construct and has actually become very detrimental, divisive, and, detracts from the fundamental purpose of a school, which is to educate. And I think actually the point about humility and the lack of humility and sort of humbleness is interesting as well, because, that is something, again, that many of our politicians seem to have forgotten, that they are there to serve us, not the other way around.
I feel as if we've only just begun the conversation, but tragically we've run out of time again. I have to just say now, thank you, Ralph Schulhammer. It's always a pleasure. You're going to be a weekly guest from now on, if I have it my way. Thanks for watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Thanks to Jasmine, of course, Molly Kingsley. It's been a pleasure to be among you. More guests next week.